Hello, everyone out there in Zoom land, wherever you may be. Excuse me, I had a coughing fit before this started, so hopefully it's not going to carry over, but it's really nice to be here with you all today. I'm sort of stalling a little bit as the attendees start to virtually stream in. So welcome to Listening Out of Place, today's talk with Joseph Clarke. My name is Mitchell Akiyama. I'm an assistant professor here at Daniels in the Visual Studies Department. First, before we do anything, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're on. I'd like to acknowledge the land that the University of Toronto operates on. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississaugas with the credit. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joseph Clarke. Joseph is a modern architectural historian and an assistant professor at U of T in the Department of Art History. His scholarship, teaching, and graduate supervision spanned various topics in 19th century and 20th century architecture. Before coming to U of T, Joseph was a practicing architect at Eisenman and also at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. And we're here to celebrate the publication of Joseph's new book, Echoes, Chambers, Architecture and the Idea of Acoustic Space, University of Pittsburgh Press, just out this year, which draws on media theory to explore how buildings facilitate communication. He's also organizing the project Canada Constructed, Architecture Landscape History. So with respect to Joseph's book, it's a book, I've read parts of it, I haven't gotten through the whole thing yet, and it's a really amazing project that I've been lucky enough to speak to Joseph about for a few years now, and that I first read, I'm assuming were initial forays into this in Grey Room, a really great issue of Grey Room on sound and space from a few years ago. So Joseph's book is looking at how we communicate and listen to one another, and the role that architectural experimentation has played in sound and space and communication. The development of modern building acoustics over the past 300 years has been entangled with profound transformations in media, music, and the public sphere. Designers' evolving efforts to alter the sound of buildings to evoke impressions of monumentality or intimacy, make speech intelligible or ensure privacy, have encouraged people to hear and interact in new ways, even as the built results have sometimes fallen short of expectations. So this lecture, which is inspired by the publication of Joseph's book, will highlight connections between architects' struggles to design for sound and the histories of deafness, ventriloquism, and the emergence of new listening publics. So Joseph is going to give a presentation, and then we're going to take about 5-10 minutes at the end for questions. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Joseph.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Mitch, and thank you to the Daniels faculty for inviting me to speak to you. It's a little bit strange to give a talk on the history of architectural acoustics when we can't all gather together in the same room. Acoustics really developed as a field of research, largely with the aim of propagating sound from a speaker or performer to an audience of people gathered in the same physical space. In the 20th and 21st centuries, of course, we've seen the development of various electronic technologies that have taken over at least some of that function, including radio and of course, today, online communication. So does architectural acoustics even matter anymore? Haven't we found better technologies for mediating communication? Well, the short answer is no. I don't think we can afford to stop thinking about building acoustics. And one important reason is that the very categories that we use today to think about sound, space, and communication, including electronically mediated communication, are deeply indebted to architecture. That's really the argument of my new book, Echoes, Chambers. And I describe this book as an architectural history of architectural acoustics, meaning that my goal was to show how, since the early Enlightenment, designers have been grappling with the problem of shaping how sound propagates through space as an architectural challenge entangled with issues of form, style, technology, typology, representation, All of these issues that are really at the core of the discipline of architecture. When I was an architecture student back in the medieval period, we had a course on environmental technology that included a brief discussion of acoustics that was quite technical. It was a matter of equations that were so complex that at a certain point, they could really only be solved by a specialist consultant. And I found this approach unsatisfying for various reasons. Acoustics can often make the difference between a building succeeding or failing. And it can profoundly change the way that we experience architecture, whether we're talking about an auditorium for lectures, a concert hall, or a restaurant, or an airport, or a hospital. You certainly know this if you've ever played music. I sing in a church choir, and the building plays an enormous role in shaping how the music sounds. But I think on an intuitive level, we all know that acoustics plays an important role in the effect that a building has on us. But somewhere in the course of our architectural training and professionalization, we marginalize sound by making it into an obscure technical problem that's usually outsourced to an engineer. And when we do this, we give up our opportunity as architects to engage with some of the most profound problems of our time, because acoustic media are critical to how we organize our society and derive meaning from the world. The age of mass media and mass politics began with the radio and the loudspeaker. This was actually pointed out by Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, who knew a thing or two about staging mass political rallies. And in many ways, the transformations in our politics and culture that started 100 years ago have intensified today. In the 1960s, Marshall McLuhan predicted with uncanny accuracy that electronic media were producing new social and cultural realities, including an increased demand for participatory forms of communication. He was thinking of radio, but for us, maybe it's social media, podcasts. Also with a seeming shrinkage of the world, so every place feels connected to every other place, with diminishing standards of privacy and with a rise in political tribalism. And McLuhan summed up this new condition of the world in a concept that he called acoustic space. To him, it was as though we humans were now all living in a single interior environment in which everyone could potentially hear everyone else at all times, a condition that was both exhilarating and also terrifying if society didn't learn how to adapt to it. And he thought that architecture had an important role to play in training and cultivating people's sensoria to deal with these new kinds of auditory stimulation. So for McLuhan, acoustics, far from being an obscure technical attribute of buildings, turned out to be connected with all of the vexations of modern communication, mass media, politics, and generally the problem of how we communicate as a society. And the problem of communication is really the problem of what a community is. So I frame my history of architectural acoustics as a response to and a critique of McLuhan. And I'm putting the book here on the screen. Because I do think there are a lot of problems with McLuhan's theory. He failed to acknowledge how much his own idea of acoustic space reflected the research of architects in the preceding centuries. And I think he overemphasized the novelty of electronic media. But I agree with McLuhan that we ought to be bringing a more complex and more artful engagement with sound into the architectural conversation. The profession of acoustic engineering developed in the early 20th century around what was in many ways a basically fixed generic standard of good acoustics. And some of my best friends are engineers, but I think we know that engineers' real skill is solving problems. If you say, I want this space in my building to sound like this, an engineer can help you do that. The challenge for architects is more open-ended. It's to imagine creatively how sound could or should figure into the design concept of a building. So my concern is really with how architects might formulate design intentions for sound. So what I want to offer in the rest of my remarks today are a few examples from across history when the sound of architecture was taken up as an architectural challenge. So to begin with the origins, we have some evidence of structures with significant acoustic properties in the ancient world, including in the ancient Greek theaters discussed by Vitruvius. But perhaps a more interesting example is the Temple of Kukulkan, a step pyramid built by the Mayan peoples indigenous to Mexico and Central America at the city of Chichen Itza. When you stand here in the right place and clap your hands, you hear a very unusual twanging echo. The Mayan builders seem almost certain to have understood the acoustic properties of limestone. And some archaeologists have pointed out that this sound resembles the call of a bird that was sacred to the Maya. So did they actually build a kind of recording of the Quetzal bird call into the temple? Honestly, this structure is a mystery. We don't actually know the intentions of its builders. Some anthropologists question whether it could have been created deliberately. But the idea of an intentionally created echo was a subject of great fascination in early modern Italy. And this was a remarkable period for research in acoustics. We're looking at an illustration from a 17th century book by Athanasius Kircher, a philosopher in Rome, in which a man stands before a wall with a series of perpendicular buttresses and utters a Latin word, clamore, or cry. Miraculously, the structure answers him. The 5 buttresses reflect fragments of his speech, each forming a new Latin word. Kircher, who was also a Catholic priest, explains that the man has addressed God. How shall I proclaim my thanks to you? Tibi vero gratias agam quo clamore. To which the echo answers with exclamation, love, manner, words, deeds. Clamore, amore, more, ore, re. So imagine this, an architectural structure that could respond to human speech and give an intelligible answer. This is like the Siri of its day. It was an example of what Kircher called echotectonics, a speculative field of acoustic research based on using geometry to predict and shape the movement of sound. Now, Kircher was not an architect, though he occasionally collaborated with architects. And a structure like this would be almost impossible to build in real life. But Kircher's real contribution was to conceive sound as a spatial phenomenon that could be modified through architecture. And he was one of the first to illustrate this vividly and to describe the sound effects in detail. This is another image from Kircher, and we see a large spiraling tube for transmitting sound intended to function as an enlarged version of a human cochlea, channeling sound from a noisy plaza into a quiet room in a palace, where the sound would come out of the mouth of a sculpted bust. The purpose of this device, Kircher explains, is not for surveillance to spy on the people outside, but rather to bemuse and delight those indoors. The idea might seem crazy, but in fact, Kircher was also the director of a museum of wondrous objects, a Wunderkammer in Rome, where the final culminating exhibit was a talking statue, much like this. But most importantly, an image like this is an evocative effort to make sense of the power and mystery of sound. It invites us to imagine a world in which the sound of every room is an object of architectural design. Kircher's speculation was prompted by experiments in Italy with the placement of choirs and musicians in churches. In the 16th century, at St. Marks Basilica in Venice, 2 singers' balconies were added. And you can see the balconies in this drawing on the right by Canaletto. This is one of them here where the musicians are standing at the front of the church, facing forward, facing towards the altar. Acoustic tests have confirmed that the intricate counterpoint in 16th century church music comes across much clearer when sung from these balconies than from other locations in the church. But at the time, older plain chant was also still used liturgically, and the plain chant singers seem to have been placed in a different part of the church where their sound would have more reverberation. So the basilica became a kind of laboratory for experimentally combining musical sounds from differently placed sources with different acoustic qualities to produce a complex synthetic auditory texture. It's actually possible for effects like this to be internalized into the music itself. An early example of this is Claudio Monteverdi's Vespers of 1610. In one movement of this composition, the contrapuntal singing of one choir is repeated a split second later by a second group of singers, and the two overlapping musical lines suggest that we're listening to a single choir singing in an immense echoing space. Monteverdi worked as music director here in San Marco, where he could actually experiment with acoustic effects generated by the building and then try to emulate them in his compositions. By the way, in the 20th century, artificial echo and reverb effects became an important technique in popular music to give it a kind of virtual sense of atmosphere. So I'll play a recording of Elvis Presley singing Mystery Train in 1955, and you'll hear a kind of simulated echo produced by the electric guitar technique and by the way that Elvis modulates his voice.
Train I ride, 16 coaches long. Train I ride, 16 coaches long. Well, that long black train got my baby and gone.
And he's singing about movement through space. So we hear the echo as suggesting a wide open landscape and maybe even the Doppler effect as the train is going by. So simulated acoustics from Monteverdi to Elvis. Clarke was part of the milieu in which these effects originated. So you can understand his idea to create a similar echo by means of architecture. And he proposed what he called a polyphonic echo. This would be another way of using reflected sound to make it seem as though other voices were present in the space. He described how a church building might be constructed in which the echoing voices of a few singers would simulate the voices of an additional choir singing along with it in counterpoint. And he speculates that a certain recent church in Rome called San Giacomo might be well suited to this purpose. Now, I hasten to add that this idea would not have worked. The reverberation in a large church like this tends to be very diffuse, not the kind of precise, discrete echo that you would need. But it is worth exploring why Clarke mentioned this church specifically. It's because of its oval plan, which at the time was quite innovative. Clarke and other 17th century writers had a theory that elliptical surfaces could be used to focus the sound of an echo. An important area of research in this period was optics. This is when the microscope and the telescope were invented, which in turn, of course, made possible many other scientific discoveries. And in optics, light was analyzed as traveling in rays. And so by analogy, it was argued that sound could be visualized in rays as well. When a sound source was located at one focus of an elliptical room, the sound should, in theory, reflect off the curved walls and converge at the opposite focus, producing an audible echo there. In the illustration on the bottom here, a mathematician shows how the acoustic properties of the ellipse might be harnessed in the design of a theater. So the performer speaks on stage, and the listener hears in surround sound as these acoustic rays bounce off both walls. The graphic representation of sound was transformative for architects' ability to design for acoustics. Now, I should say that sound is a very complex phenomenon, and a line diagram is at best an abstraction that doesn't account for acoustics with total accuracy, but it was still invaluable to architects as a heuristic, as a design tool. In the 20th century, some physicists and acoustic engineers criticized architects' use of these diagrams to visualize sound for being oversimplified, and there's some truth to that. But this is how architects work. We think graphically, and what we can't visualize, we can't really understand within the framework of our discipline. There's actually an important essay by the architectural historian Robin Evans called Translations from Drawing to Building. And Evans writes about what he calls the apparent disadvantage under which architects labor, never working directly with the object of their thought, in other words, the physical building, always working at it through the intervening medium of drawing. But what Evans goes on to argue is that far from being a hindrance, drawing can actually have a powerful generative role in architecture through its creative interplay with the designer's imagination, and can open architectural possibilities that couldn't have been conceived any other way. And that's certainly true for acoustics. Some of the most generative acoustic experiments in architecture have been the result of efforts to translate between graphic diagrams and sounds. We see this in the 18th century. We sometimes think of the Enlightenment as defined by print and by visual culture, but there was a flourishing of architectural acoustics as well. On the left are two drawings of an unbuilt theater design from one of the first books on acoustics written by an architect, showing how an actor's voice in a theater originates on stage and then arrives at the audience's ears after bouncing off the walls and ceiling. But despite this redirection of the sound, if the hall is well designed, the acoustics will be such that you won't be confused about the real origin of the sound on stage. If it's not properly designed, you might imagine that the sound is coming from somewhere else. And by the way, on the right is what I believe to be the earliest image of a ventriloquist performance. Ventriloquism was born during this same period. At this subterranean cafe in Paris, the proprietor was also a ventriloquist, and he would stand on a stool and pretend to speak through a window grill with a messenger outside. The voice of the messenger would claim to have an important letter for one of the customers, who would then rush outside only to find nobody there. I don't think this trick was a very good way to attract new customers to the cafe, but to the regular patrons, it was highly amusing. The sudden popularity of ventriloquism reflects a fascination with the spatial character of sound as it moves or is perceived to move through the architectural environment in unexpected ways. Theaters and opera houses were, not surprisingly, an important area of acoustic experimentation in the 19th century. And the study of their acoustics was a subject of both practical design research and also scientific study. So we're seeing here a couple of German physicists, two brothers, on the image on the bottom left, drip mercury and study the ripples to visualize how sound might propagate in a building of the same shape. In the 1780s, the composer Richard Wagner commissioned a custom theater in southern Germany for performing his productions. Wagner is a really interesting figure who had a cult following. And he believed musical drama was a powerful tool for unifying the German lands into a single nation. So here again, we get the political power of acoustics and acoustic media. This building is widely seen by scholars of music and media as an essential site of cultural modernity. But it's been strangely neglected in the history of architecture. But in fact, its designer, named Otto Bruchwald, was a specialist in acoustics. And so in my book, I analyze this building and I show how acoustics was central to Wagner's idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art. But let's move to a 20th century example. The American Gothic Revival architect Bertram Goodhue was designing St. Thomas's Episcopal Church in New York City in the early 20th century. And he created a design that was widely praised for its faithfulness to medieval design principles and an honest use of materials. And this church really became a kind of prototype for ingeniously adapting the Gothic style to a busy Manhattan street corner. But the acoustics presented a challenge. In the Gothic cathedrals that he modeled this building on, sound can reverberate off the stone interior for 10 seconds or even longer, which enhances the effects of chanting, but garbles speech. And in a Catholic church in the Middle Ages, where the service was conducted in a Latin that almost nobody understood, the reverb would simply add atmosphere. But in a modern Protestant church, where the service was in English and the congregation was expected to follow the sermon carefully, it would be a disaster. So the building needed to play a kind of audiovisual trick. It needed to look Catholic, but sound Protestant. And so Goodhue worked with Wallace Sabine, a physics professor at Harvard, and Rafael Guastavino, a Spanish immigrant builder who specialized in making ceramic tiles for architectural vaults. And they collaborated to invent a new kind of tile that would resemble stone, but absorb sound. Actually, the approach proved so successful that generations of musicians in this church complained about the lack of reverberation. And in the post-war period, the church actually spent years and a lot of money retrofitting the building to add back in the reverberation that had been so effectively removed. My final example, which I want to dwell on for a little bit longer, is about a collaboration between the Franco-American experimental composer Edgar Verrez and Le Corbusier. In 1936, Verrez announced that he was working on a new kind of music that he said would seem to dance around the room in three-dimensional figures. He explained to an interviewer, "The feeling is akin to that aroused by beams of light sent forth by a powerful searchlight. For the ear, just as for the eye, it gives a sense of prolongation, a journey into space." His idea was to project sound through a concert hall in choreographed patterns. Now, electric amplification technology had advanced very dramatically over the 1920s and 30s, and it's no surprise that a modernist composer would try to use it creatively. Verrez said that he wanted to use loudspeakers to create a sensation of blocks of sound or beams of sound moving around the room. But this idea that he had to shoot sound through the space in patterns had actually first struck him years earlier in a totally different context. He told the interviewer how it was as he was attending a performance of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony at a concert hall in Paris, and the building's excessive reverberation had provoked a kind of three-dimensional sensation. He said, "I seemed to feel the music detaching itself and projecting itself into space." The building where he experienced this impression was the Art Deco recital hall of the Pleyel Piano Company, completed in 1927. And the interior of this building featured a curved reflecting surface that rose behind the stage and soared over the audience. It was designed by Gustave Lion, Pleyel's instrument designer who also consulted on fixing acoustically deficient buildings. Lyon diagrammed, you can see here on the top, he diagrammed the propagation of sound as rays, so in a modified version of the echotectonic approach, and he calculated the curvature of the salle Pleyel to encourage the propagation of sound and mitigate distracting echoes. Lyon was also an acoustic advisor to Le Corbusier. And we're looking here at Le Corbusier's unbuilt, but very influential design for the League of Nations headquarters, also 1927. Acoustics was a key selling point in Corbusier's competition entry. He actually worked with Lyon to design one of these giant swooping reflectors for the auditorium ceiling. Corbusier adopted a similar design in 1931 for his Palace of the Soviets project, also unbuilt. But this time, he also integrated electronic amplification. And we can see in the diagram below how a microphone above the stage was supposed to collect the sound of the performance, which would then be emitted by a single loudspeaker positioned at the front of the stage. The sound would then travel up to the curved roof of the auditorium and finally reflect back, bounce back off the ceiling to reach the ears of the listeners. It's not clear this would have worked very well, but Le Corbusier was trying to think through how to reconcile older techniques in which the form of the building itself was meant to serve as a kind of giant loudspeaker with the electronic media of microphones and amplifiers. After the Second World War, Corbusier continued this idea of trying to reconcile or trying to integrate electronic sound with the older tradition of architectural acoustics. He wanted to create an electroacoustic installation for his famous chapel at Ronchamp. And the drawings and models of this building show a metal grid structure next to the chapel. You see it here in the drawing and here in one of the models. The idea was to mount loudspeakers on this grid, which would automatically emit deliberately unsettling noises at set times of day. So this was really supposed to be his version of a church bell tower. To create the sound for this installation, which of course was ultimately not built, Corbusier approached Edgard Verrez, who by this point had begun pioneering experiments with avant-garde electronic music by sampling noises from the environment and then manipulating them electronically. When Corbusier invited Verrez to collaborate on the Ronchamp installation, he suggested that, quote, magnificent liturgical music of the past might be directly framed by a background of modern music, by interventions which are violent and impersonal. So his idea was to retrain people's ears to help them adjust to modern life and to reconcile it with older forms of religious and cultural experience. Now, I discussed this project for Ronchamp in my book in detail, but once again, the project fell through. But a couple of years later, Le Corbusier was approached by the Philips Electronics Corporation, which made and still makes audio equipment. Philips had developed a technology for adding artificial reverberation to concert halls that didn't have enough. Concealed microphones and loudspeakers could simulate echo or reverb, altering the hall's perceived acoustic properties without actually changing its architecture. The system was actually installed successfully to fix the problematic acoustics of La Scala Opera House in Milan. But it was hard to market the system because the effects were very subtle, and the opera houses didn't like to advertise the fact that there were acoustic problems with their building, and they also didn't like to advertise that they were electronically mediating the sound of the performance, because real opera aficionados like to believe that they're hearing the unmediated sound of the human voice. So this was a problem for Philips, who was trying to market and sell their technology. And so as one Philips engineer said, the better an acoustic engineer does his work, the more natural the result will appear and the less thanks he can expect. So what Philips really wanted, they came to Le Corbusier and asked him to create a World's Fair pavilion where its technology could really take center stage and be showcased to the public. One of the engineers explained, quote, "The listeners were to have the illusion that various sound sources were in motion around them, rising and falling, coming together and moving apart again. And moreover, the space in which this took place was to seem at one instant to be narrow and dry, and at another to seem like a cathedral." Le Corbusier eagerly took the commission. Some of you probably know the building that resulted from it. The Philips Pavilion was a concrete structure. You would go inside and witness a short, immersive audiovisual work. But it was the sonic component that was really primary. And Le Corbusier insisted, over the trepidation of Philips executives, that Verrez be commissioned to create the sound. So Philips engineers wired over 200 loudspeakers inside the pavilion. So the music of Verrez and a shorter interlude piece composed by Iannis Xenakis could be manipulated acoustically. Le Corbusier described this effect vividly with a quotation from the American writer Henry Miller. "Voices in the sky, as if invisible hands were magically spinning the dials of fantastic radio stations. Voices filling the space, crossing, overlapping, interpenetrating, breaking, repelling, crashing, rubbing up against each other." I actually think Xenakis' composition was in some ways the most interesting here. It was brief, it was only 2 minutes long, but it was an 11-channel work, so 11 distinct audio tracks, which would seem to move continuously in space from one speaker to another. And he drew this diagram on the right of how sounds would circulate around visitors' heads in the dark. So this was at least as much a musical composition in space as in time. So it took 22 years and several false starts, but this was finally the realization of Verrez's original idea. The Philips Pavilion was only a temporary structure and it had to be taken down the following year. But since the 1980s, when sound art emerged as a concept, the Philips Pavilion has been identified as a turning point in the spatial design of electronic sound. And Le Corbusier's determination to incorporate sound as a dimension of architecture became an important influence on McLuhan and his media theory of acoustic space. So to wrap all of this up, there are few problems more important in the world today than how we communicate and how we listen to one another. And of course, how we communicate is completely entangled with electronic media, but it's also, and will never stop being, entangled with architecture. And what I've been arguing is that architects can't hope to engage this problem purely through the language of engineering. Acoustics is not simply a scientific problem to be solved. There's no such thing as good acoustics or bad acoustics in the abstract. So the challenge for architects who want to take sound seriously is not to learn all of the scientific intricacies of acoustic design. We do have consultants for this. The real challenge is to conceive and to express our intentions for sound in our designs. We need to learn to ask for what we want. And before that, we need to decide what we want. And in order to do this, I think first we need to learn to listen carefully to buildings. And this might seem obvious, but musicians put enormous effort into ear training, and we can do that too. And second, we need to find a disciplinary foothold in acoustic experimentation by cultivating an architectural vocabulary for how to talk about acoustic effects and graphic techniques for representing sound in our designs. I will just finish with a quotation from a scientist, actually. This is Johann Wilhelm Ritter, a German scientist and philosopher who lived in the early 19th century. So actually the same period as the ventriloquists I was talking about earlier. Ritter was interested in human perception, and he explored it by administering electric shocks to his own ears and other body parts and recording the sensations he experienced. This technique, no doubt, had something to do with his early death at age 33. He was part of the Romantic science movement that was reacting against the rationalism of the Enlightenment, with its tendency to pigeonhole science, art, and philosophy into separate branches of knowledge. Ritter thought that scientists actually needed to know about culture and vice versa, because these were all ways of exploring the truths of the universe and of human nature. Hence the title of one of his books, Physics as Art. And he was especially fascinated by the mysterious power of acoustics. And remember that 19th century Germany was a golden age for symphonic music and for the building of concert halls and opera houses. So this quotation I'm going to read is completely over the top, but I like it anyway. Hearing is an internal seeing, the most innerly internal consciousness. With hearing, one can orient oneself 1,000 times better than with any other sense. The sense of hearing is among all senses of the universe, the highest, greatest, most encompassing. Certainly it is the only general, the universal sense. There is no perspective on the universe so whole and unlimited as the acoustical one. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joseph. So a couple of questions have come in, but I'm going to be self-serving in the way that I think is the entitlement of the moderator to start off the questions. So that was super interesting and fascinating. Thank you so much. And I'm going to acknowledge again that I haven't read the entire book. And I'm starting with the first sentence of the introduction because I just think it's such a provocation.
That's a good place to start. Yeah.
And you're right, until relatively recently, the most sophisticated sonic media were buildings. And I think this is my area, but what you brought out for me in a way that I hadn't really considered before is the, we obviously we don't think of architecture as like a storage medium or as a medium that propagates and mediates information. I do now, and we do now after your talk. But I really appreciate the way that you're extending things like phonographs or CD players or electronically mediated sound, and you're extending that back into at least the 17th, 16th century. I find that really, really powerful to, and it adds a layer of responsibility, I think, that architects are, as I understand, are not often really building in that question, like what kind of sound we want up into this space. It's often something that is remediated or dealt with after the fact, like, oh, this room is too loud, let's put some dampening panels on or whatever. But then when you spoke about engineering not being able to produce good acoustics because there's good acoustics is entirely a subjective phenomenon, it prompted a really kind of banal question for me, but that is, what are the more interesting acoustic spaces that you've experienced? And then I also wanted to ask you, what do you want? What would you ask for in an acoustic space that the engineer might not be able to provide with a mechanical, like with a formula?
Well, thanks, Mitch. Those are. I think that was more than one question. That was great. A lot of interesting observations. I would say a few things. So, first of all, buildings as media. I think media, for me, media theory has been a really useful method for approaching the problem of architectural acoustics. Just as a side note, when I was going through architecture school, we had sort of two ways to talk about sound, either through the language of engineering, which tended to be very mathematical and kind of algebraic equations, or the language of phenomenology. And architectural phenomenology, at least as I was exposed to it in architecture school was tended to be very fuzzy and had a sort of touchy-feely character to it, and it was very difficult to establish rigor or to be precise using this way of thinking to me. So for me, discovering that media theory could be a way in to the problem of acoustics was really important. And there actually are media theorists, I mentioned McLuhan, but also contemporary writers like Wolfgang Ernst, who have written a bit about architecture as a kind of acoustic medium, including a medium for storing sound. And if you think about it, an echo is the storage of a sound, albeit for a very short period of time, but it actually stores the sound and then plays it back a moment later. So this is an interesting sort of paradigm for thinking about sound. But I do think that, as you say, there's a responsibility that architects have to think about how our buildings mediate sound, including, how whose voices in the building can be heard and who can hear them, and the kinds of sounds that our buildings make possible. What kinds of acoustic spaces are the most interesting in my experience? Well, one that I write about in the book is a cave in Sicily that is called the Ear of Dionysius. And this is a cave that is said to have originated in antiquity, in ancient Greece, in the ancient Greek period when the city of Syracuse was founded by the Greeks. But the cave was really discovered, and it began to be written about in the 17th century. And actually, Clarke, the philosopher I mentioned, went to Sicily because this cave was so renowned for its sonic properties that he wanted to hear it himself in person. And it's known for a very loud echo. But it's not only the echo. Even when there's nobody speaking, of course, there are tourists who go in there all the time and shout and clap and listen to the echo. But even when nobody's making any sound, there's a very strange kind of rustling noise. And I don't know whether it comes from the water or from the wind or from birds flapping around it, because there are birds in the cave and then the sound echoes. But it has a very singular sound. And one that was actually very important in the history, in the discourse of acoustics in the 17th and 18th centuries. So that would be an example. But the interesting challenge is for me that as an architect, I can hear a space with interesting sounds like this, and we don't really have vocabulary to talk about it. I'm struggling just to describe what this space sounded like, because you can say, oh, it has a lot of reverb, but beyond that, we haven't developed the words, the language, even to describe it or represent it. And that's a problem if we want to integrate this kind of thinking in a more rigorous way into our designs.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we have the language. The phenomenological language for sound is kind of limited. Like even when we're talking about timbre, that's still a pretty technical, quantitative almost way of talking about sound. I'm sure we could riff for a while, but I'm going to get to some questions from the audience. Jason Nguyen, who is the chair of the programming committee, is asking this question. He writes,
Hi, Jason.
Hi, Joseph, fabulous talk and fascinating images. I love the Kircher images, Kircher images, and the analogies between body and building. Could you speak a bit about the ethics of acoustics, especially as discourses on ethics/politics, and how they intersect in the design of acoustic space? I think here about the debates on the theater in the 18th century by Diderot and others. He's making reference to the so-called contested parterre, and there's Wagner too, whose sensorial approach to the interior of the theater dovetails with a sort of politics of experience. He's thinking of Juliet Cossa's work. Could you ruminate on how and why acoustical and theatrical space have been so contested, at least in public spaces? He's thinking about the contested spaces now of social media as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great point. Yes, in fact, I showed briefly a drawing from the 17th century, sorry, of a design for an elliptical theater, in which you might notice there was a performer and there was one listener, and so the acoustics were designed so it would sound really good from one seat, from one spot, where presumably the ruler would be sitting. And then everybody else in the theater would have a kind of correspondingly worse auditory access to the performance. This actually did become a major controversy in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly because the theater building has often been seen as a kind of microcosm of society. All of the different social classes are there, seated in different tiers at different levels of the building. With the increasing power of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, challenging the more hierarchical aristocratic system where the ruler is at the top and would have the best seat in the house, people who were paying for a ticket, who had bought a ticket to come to the theater, wanted to be able to hear. And so this was actually a major driver of change and the discovery of new kind of acoustic paradigms, the effort to, rather than focusing the sound into a few privileged points, scattering the sound as uniformly as possible so more people could hear. So I would say that this was a major part of the politics of acoustics in the 19th century. The other interesting point that one could say more about is the role of sound and music, but also acoustics in political unification of Germany in the 19th century. So for most of the 19th century, Germany was not a country. It was multiple countries. It was many small countries which were struggling to unify. And eventually in the 1870s, they did unify and form the German Empire. But this was in fact a great progressive cause in the 19th century, was to support German unification. And a key means of doing that was to establish a unified theater and musical culture. And so the building of theaters where people could go and watch performances and hear the German language being spoken and listen to German music composed by German composers was actually really important for producing that kind of unity. In the 20th century, we might look at the examples either of Hitler and the Nazi Party, and I quoted Albert Speer saying that the radio and the loudspeaker were the two technologies that allowed the rise of Hitler. But we could also look at the same moment at the efforts to form the League of Nations, so acoustics being used to advance the cause of liberal democracy. So there's absolutely a political story to tell about the uses of sound and the architectural mediation of sound. And this is an issue that I discuss quite a bit in the book. So thank you.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, I think we often don't really give enough thought or credit to the role of acoustics and sound in projects of nationalism, like Benedict Anderson writes about national anthems and talks about this phenomenon of unisonance, and that it's much less prioritized in imagined communities than other forms of media. But for him, hearing things, imagining other people hearing the things that you're hearing is an important way of connecting to the idea of the nation state as a network of people who don't know each other. But that, I think, yeah, that's an important point about the spatial turn of that too, in the architectural manifestation. I have a question here from Michael Brisson, who says, thanks for a great talk. A contemporary collective art form that explores the emotive effect of musical arrangements and reflective structures is found in the DCI movement, which I have to admit, I don't know what that is. Arrangers compose the music of great...
Drum corps.
Sorry?
Drum corps.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, there it is at the end. Arrangers compose the music of great composers to be played by horns moving and rotating with a series of stadia in the US during a summer season. The effects created both visually and orally can be deeply moving in the tradition of choir location and procession in traditional architecture. It is called drum corps. That wasn't really a question, but Do you have a response for
That's
that?
great. Yeah. That's a really interesting point. I confess I don't know a huge amount about the art of the drum corps, but it does bring to mind the role of. I mean, you mentioned horns, and actually the design of instruments and brass instruments in particular have intersected in really interesting ways with the development of architectural acoustics. Adolphe Sax, the famous Parisian instrument designer in the 19th century, who of course invented the instrument that's named after him, was also very interested in acoustics and thinking about the kind of larger spatial setting for where his instruments could be played. And they're very loud instruments, so it could be an extremely large space. And in fact, for the 1867 World's Fair in Paris, he created a completely speculative, as kind of schematic design for a concert hall, which is envisioning an enormous space as a kind of musical instrument. It's a very strange design, actually, but it was an important inspiration for Wagner when he built his opera house in the following decade. And Wagner was very interested in sax and was also designing brass instruments for his own productions. So that's a great point, and I'll think more about the drum corps movement. But I thank you for the comment.
Yeah, it also has me thinking about, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but Charles Ives having two marching bands playing different pieces of music coming together.
Yes.
That even, there's a certain spatial imaginary in that too. It's not a piece, it's a piece of music that comes into being as it clashes in space.
Yeah, absolutely.
So David Lieberman says, thank you, Joseph, for the compelling discussions of your text. And many, I don't know if he's chiding, but he's saying that I really should read the book in its entirety, which I totally agree. So parallel to the engineering of Kierkegaard's echoes, one might consider Borromini's San Carlino de Quattro Fontana, sensuous surfaces enfolding the space with the unheard sounds of angels' wings, clearly an architectural composition founded in orality rather than a problem created by architects to be solved by engineers. From acoustics to optics, at the scale of human listening, sound and light perform in similar manner. From Teofilo Galaccini to Robin Evans, might we draw with sound, graphic translation, and or notation as a visual text remain problematic, and yet do we need the resistance of surface and physical containment to apprehend sounds and music and the opportunities of engagement with others? We will leave Le Corbusier, Verrez, and Xenakis for another time and more questions. Also not really in the form of a question, but as you
yeah, thank you so much, David. That's great. Borromini and Bernini. Actually, Kierkegaard collaborated with both Borromini and Bernini at different times, and I think Borromini in particular got some acoustic thinking from Kierkegaard. So that's really interesting. You also mentioned angels. The sounds of angels, and in fact, often in Baroque churches, the angels, the little cherubs that you see sort of up around the tops of the walls, the bottom of the ceiling, have the very interesting function of diffusing sound, because especially if the angels are really fat, they are convex, and so the sound bounces and helps to propagate through the room. So the angels' voices are not always unheard.
We've got about 1 minute. I'm going to quickly go to Charles's question, because I think this is a really good one, from Charles Stankovich, who is, to condense this, is asking about headphones as maybe the most radical example of sort of acoustic architecture. So while it's a 20th century invention, maybe a growing interest with the move to the metaverse, could you extend your thinking on this?
Yeah, I mean, what to say? I mean, yes, I think headphones are not something that I discuss a lot in the book, because the book sort of ends in the mid 20th century. I do think headphones have absolutely completely changed the way that we experience urban space, certainly, and really do challenge the idea of acoustics as creating a kind of common shared sonic environment that we all inhabit. And yet at the same time, they've also created opportunities for acoustics to become in a way more important, because the effects that you hear when sound is coming directly into your ears, and also when the sound, like whether it's music or whether it's a podcast, is recorded by somebody speaking directly into a microphone, close miking, and then comes directly into your ears, you're not necessarily hearing any acoustic impact of the space, but these acoustic effects then have to be added artificially. And so the use of artificial echo and reverb can even become more elaborate because the physical architecture is taken out of the picture in a way. But thinking through the relationship between the physical space of architecture and the technologies like headphones is a really interesting problem that I find fascinating.
Thanks. So we're just a tiny bit over time. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us. Thank you so much to Joseph for talking to us about his work and the new book. I hope you'll all go out and procure a copy. And I see Joseph is typing an answer to Arash, whose question we didn't get to. So thank you so much again. Please join us for the final event in our series for the fall, which is a book talk on November 30th at 12 p.m. on landscape citizenships. So that's Tuesday, November 30th at 12 p.m. And I hope we will see you all soon at another Daniel's event. Thank you, Joseph, and thanks everyone, and take care.
Thank you.